I understood every word my husband said to his parents in German. They had no idea I was fluent. And what I heard that night changed everything. The chandelier in the dining room cast warm light across the mahogany table as I brought out the roast I had spent 3 hours preparing. It was Sunday evening, and like every Sunday evening for the past 4 years, my in-laws were joining us for dinner at our home in Westchester. The house smelled of garlic and rosemary, and I had set the table with the fine china that had been a wedding gift from my own parents. Everything looked perfect, exactly as I had planned it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Hartmann, though I was born Elena Rodriguez. I am 31 years old, and I run my own financial consulting firm specializing in wealth management for high-net-worth individuals. I built the business from nothing over the past 7 years, starting with a single client I met while working at a mid-tier accounting firm, and growing it into a practice that now manages over $200 million in assets. The work is demanding and requires constant attention to detail, long hours, and the ability to navigate complex financial landscapes while maintaining absolute discretion. I am good at what I do, and the success of my business reflects that competence. My husband Michael is 33. We met during my final year of graduate school, when he was working as a marketing coordinator at a software company. He was charming and attentive, with an easy smile and a way of making me feel seen and valued that I had not experienced in previous relationships. His family was originally from Munich, and he had moved to the United States when he was 12 years old. He spoke fluent German with his parents, though his English was completely unaccented after 2 decades in America. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and we married in a beautiful ceremony that combined elements of both our cultural backgrounds. The early years of our marriage had been happy, or at least I had believed they were happy. Michael had been supportive of my business ambitions, or so it seemed. He attended networking events with me, listened when I talked about difficult clients, and never complained when I worked late or traveled for meetings. His own career had been less meteoric. He had moved from the marketing coordinator position to a senior marketing role, but his salary had plateaued around $80,000 annually while my income had grown substantially. I now earned approximately $450,000 per year, and my business was positioned for continued growth. We had purchased our current home 3 years ago. It was a 4-bedroom colonial with a large backyard, updated kitchen, and proximity to excellent schools for the children we plan to have eventually. The house cost $1.2 million. I had provided the entire down payment of $300,000 from my business earnings and bonuses. The mortgage was in both our names, but I paid approximately 70% of it from my income, while Michael contributed 30%. This arrangement had never been explicitly discussed. It had simply evolved naturally based on our respective earnings, and I had never considered it problematic. Marriage meant partnership, and partners supported each other according to their abilities. Michael's parents, Friedrich and Ingrid Hartmann, were in their late 60s. They had retired 5 years ago and lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. Friedrich had worked as an engineer for a manufacturing company, and Ingrid had been a part-time librarian. They had not saved extensively for retirement, relying primarily on Social Security and a small pension from Friedrich's employer. Money was tight for them, and Michael occasionally helped them with expenses. I had never objected to this support. They were family, and helping family was important to me. What I had not told Michael or his parents was that I spoke fluent German. My maternal grandmother had been born in Austria, and had come to America as a young woman. She had insisted on teaching me German as a child, and I had continued studying it through high school and college. I could read, write, and speak it at a near-native level. I had never mentioned this skill to Michael's family because the topic had simply never come up naturally. When we first met, Michael had asked if I spoke any other languages besides English and Spanish, and I had mentioned French, which I had studied in school but spoke poorly. I had not thought to mention German at the time, and afterward, as I heard his parents speaking it around me, I had become curious about what they said when they assumed I could not understand. So I had remained silent about my comprehension, listening passively to their conversations without revealing that I knew what they were saying. For the most part, their German conversations had been mundane. Comments about the weather, discussions about relatives back in Germany, observations about American politics or culture. Nothing remarkable or concerning. They were polite to me in English, if somewhat formal and distant. Ingrid had never been particularly warm, but I had attributed that to cultural differences or perhaps a general reserved nature. Friedrich was friendlier, always thanking me for meals and asking polite questions about my work, though I noticed he seemed uncomfortable when I discussed my business success in any detail. This particular Sunday had started like any other. Michael had picked up his parents from their apartment in the afternoon. I had spent the morning preparing the meal, cleaning the house, and setting everything up for a pleasant family dinner. I had also spent several hours that morning working on a client presentation, reviewing financial statements and preparing recommendations for a portfolio reallocation. One of my larger clients was considering a significant investment, and I needed to have everything ready for a meeting on Tuesday. I had worked in my home office while Michael watched television in the living room. When his parents arrived, I greeted them at the door with a smile. Ingrid kissed me on both cheeks in the European fashion, her lips barely touching my skin. Friedrich shook my hand warmly and commented on how wonderful the house smelled. They settled into the living room while I finished the final preparations in the kitchen. Michael joined them, and I could hear them speaking in German as I worked. I was only half paying attention, focused on timing everything so the meal would be served at the proper temperature. The roast came out perfectly. The potatoes were golden and crispy. The green beans were tender with just the right amount of bite. I had even made a black forest cake for dessert, using a recipe I had found online and spending considerable time on the layers and cherry filling. As I plated everything and carried it to the dining room, I felt a sense of satisfaction. This was what family should be. Gathering together, sharing a meal, maintaining connections. We sat down at the table. Michael poured wine for everyone except himself, as he had mentioned earlier that he had a headache and was avoiding alcohol. The conversation began in English, as it always did when I was present. Friedrich complimented the meal. Ingrid commented on the table setting. We discussed the weather, which had been unusually warm for October. We talked about a cousin in Germany who was getting married next spring. Everything was pleasant and normal. Then Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned slightly. He said something to his parents in German, and I continued eating while appearing not to pay attention. This was standard. They often slipped into German for brief comments or observations, and I had grown accustomed to it. But this time what Michael said made me freeze with my fork halfway to my mouth. He said in German, "I am exhausted from keeping up this charade. She works all the time and barely notices what is happening in her own marriage. It makes everything so much easier." I kept my expression neutral and continued eating, though my heart had begun to race. I focused on chewing slowly and swallowing, maintaining the appearance of someone enjoying their meal, while completely oblivious to the conversation happening around them. Ingrid responded also in German, "You must be patient, Michael. These things take time. Is everything progressing as planned?" "Yes," Michael said, his voice low. "The accounts are ready. I have been transferring money slowly so nothing appears suspicious. By the time she realizes what has happened, it will be too late to recover most of it." My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my water glass. I took a sip, willing myself to remain calm and show nothing on my face. This could not be what it sounded like. There had to be some explanation. Perhaps they were discussing something else, some matter I was misunderstanding without full context. Friedrich spoke next, his tone cautious. "You are certain she does not suspect anything? She is a financial professional, Michael. Surely she reviews your accounts?" "We have separate accounts," Michael replied in German. "She makes so much money that she has never bothered to look at mine. She thinks I am contributing my share to household expenses, but I have been putting in less and less over the past year. She has not noticed. She just covers the difference automatically because she has more than enough." Ingrid laughed softly. "She is so busy playing the big successful businesswoman that she cannot see what is right in front of her. You have chosen well, Michael. A woman who is too proud and too distracted to pay attention to her own husband." I carefully cut another piece of roast and put it in my mouth. The meat tasted like cardboard. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was hearing, while simultaneously maintaining perfect composure. I could not let them know I understood. Not yet. Not until I knew the full scope of what was happening. How much have you managed to set aside? Friedrich asked. Almost 200,000, Michael said. Between what I have been skimming from the household accounts and the credit cards I opened in both our names. She has excellent credit, so the limits were very high. I have been making minimum payments, so she has not seen any missed payment notices, but the debt is accumulating. $200,000. Credit cards in both our names. Skimming from household accounts. The words echoed in my head as I smiled blandly and nodded when Ingrid said something to me in English about the potatoes being delicious. And the timeline? Ingrid asked in German, leaning forward slightly. Another 3 months, Michael said. I want to reach 300,000 if possible. Then I will file for divorce, and with the way I have structured everything, it will look like she was hiding assets and spending recklessly. I have documentation showing large transfers to accounts she does not know about, but they are accounts I control. My lawyer says we can argue that she was planning to leave me and was hiding money in preparation. It will tie up the divorce proceedings for years, and in the meantime, the funds will be safely tucked away where she cannot access them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My entire body felt cold. This was not a misunderstanding or a conversation taken out of context. This was a plan. A detailed, calculated plan to defraud me, destroy my credit, and steal money I had earned through years of difficult work. And his parents were not just aware of it. They were actively encouraging it and asking questions about the details. What about the business? Friedrich asked. Can you access any of those assets? That is more complicated, Michael admitted in German. The business accounts are completely separate and in her name only. But I have been documenting everything I can about her clients and business practices. If I can find anything even slightly questionable, I can threaten to report her to regulatory authorities unless she agrees to a favorable settlement. She will pay to protect her reputation and client relationships. You are so clever, my son, Ingrid said warmly in German. Your father and I are very proud of you. When this is finished, you will be able to help us properly. We have been struggling in that terrible apartment, and we deserve better after all we have done for you. With your settlement money, you can ensure we have a comfortable retirement. That is the plan, Mama, Michael said. I am doing this for us, for our family. She has more money than she knows what to do with, and she flaunts it constantly with her expensive clothes and her business success. She acts like she is better than everyone else. It is only fair that some of that wealth comes to people who actually deserve it. I stood up smoothly, my chair making only the softest sound against the floor. All three of them looked at me with mild, pleasant expressions. I smiled back. Please excuse me for just a moment, I said in English. I need to check on the dessert in the kitchen. I walked calmly from the dining room, my steps measured and steady. Once I was through the kitchen door and out of their sight, I gripped the edge of the counter and forced myself to breathe slowly. My mind was spinning, but I could not afford to lose control. I needed to think clearly and strategically. Everything I had just heard needed to be processed and verified before I took any action. I pulled out my phone and quickly opened my banking apps. I checked every account I had, both personal and business. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The balances were what I expected them to be. But then I noticed something I had not paid attention to before. There were transfers I did not remember making. Small amounts mostly. 5,000 here, 3,000 there. Individually, they were not particularly noticeable given the normal flow of money in and out of my accounts. But together, over the course of what appeared to be the past 18 months, they added up to substantial sums. I opened my credit card accounts next. I had 3 cards that I used regularly, and I monitored them carefully. But as I scrolled through the list of accounts under my name, I saw 2 additional cards I had never opened. They both showed significant balances. One was at $43,000. The other was at $38,000. Both were in my name, but I had never applied for them, never received them, never used them. My hands were shaking now. I set the phone down on the counter and pressed my palms flat against the granite surface, feeling its cool solidity. This was real. Everything Michael had said was true. He had been systematically stealing from me for over a year, destroying my credit, and planning to divorce me in a way that would maximize his financial gain while destroying my reputation and tying me up in legal proceedings that would damage my business. And I had been completely oblivious. I had been so focused on my work, so confident in my marriage, so trusting in the man I had chosen to build a life with, that I had not seen any of this coming. He had counted on that. He had exploited my trust and my busy schedule. Knowing I would not micromanage household finances or question his contributions, because I believed we were partners working together toward shared goals. I heard laughter from the dining room. They were talking in German again, and I could hear the casual, comfortable tone of their voices. They thought they had one. They thought I was in the kitchen, completely ignorant, preparing dessert for people who were actively plotting to destroy my financial security and professional reputation. I picked up my phone again and opened the voice recording app. I set it to record and placed it in my pocket. Then I took several long, slow breaths, arranging my face into a pleasant expression. I picked up the black forest cake I had made and carefully placed it on a serving platter. I added small plates and forks to a tray. Then I walked back into the dining room carrying everything with a smile. "Here we are," I said cheerfully in English. "I hope everyone saved room for dessert." I served the cake, cutting generous slices for everyone. They accepted them with thanks and compliments. As I sat back down with my own slice, Michael said something else in German to his parents. The recording device in my pocket was capturing every word. "She really has outdone herself tonight," he said in German. "It almost makes me feel guilty." Almost. Friedrich chuckled. "A man must do what is necessary to secure his future. She will be fine. Women like her always land on their feet. And perhaps this will teach her some humility." "When do you plan to tell her?" Ingrid asked in German. "After the holidays," Michael replied in German. "I want to get through Christmas first. Her family always gives generous gifts, and I would like to receive mine before I file the papers. There is no point in leaving money on the table." They all laughed. I took a bite of cake and chewed slowly, maintaining my oblivious expression while my mind worked through what needed to happen next. I could not confront them now. Not yet. I needed to gather more evidence, secure my assets, and consult with professionals before I made any moves. If I revealed what I knew now, Michael would have time to hide what he had already stolen and potentially destroy evidence of his fraud. I needed to be smart about this. Strategic. I needed to treat this like I would treat any complex financial problem for a client. Assess the situation thoroughly, identify all the risks and exposures, develop a comprehensive plan to protect assets and minimize damage, and then execute that plan with precision and discipline. So I smiled and ate my cake and made pleasant conversation in English while they spoke in German about their plans to rob me blind. I laughed at Friedrich's joke about American football. I accepted Ingrid's compliment on the cake recipe. I played the role of the oblivious, trusting wife who had no idea her husband was betraying her in the most calculating way possible. When dinner was over, I cleared the dishes while Michael drove his parents back to Queens. I loaded the dishwasher mechanically, my movements automatic while my brain processed everything I had learned. The house felt different now. It was no longer the home I had worked so hard to provide for us. It was a stage set where my husband had been performing the role of loving partner while actively working to destroy me. I went upstairs to my home office and locked the door. Then I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. I took screenshots of every account, every transfer, every credit card I had not opened. I created a detailed timeline based on what I could see in the financial records, tracing the pattern of theft back as far as the evidence showed. I sent encrypted copies of everything to my personal email account and to a secure cloud storage service. Then I began making a list of calls I needed to make first thing Monday morning. My attorney, my accountant, my bank, the credit card companies for the fraudulent accounts, a forensic accountant to trace exactly where the money had gone, a private investigator to document everything Michael was doing, and a therapist because I was going to need support to get through what was coming. I heard the garage door open as Michael returned home. I quickly closed all the windows on my computer and opened a client file so it would appear I had been working. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then he knocked gently on my office door. "Elena? Are you still working?" "Just finishing up," I called out, keeping my voice light. "I will be down in a few minutes." "Okay." I am going to watch some television. Join me when you are ready." His voice was warm and affectionate. The same voice that had told me he loved me that morning. The same voice that had been speaking in German just hours ago about how I was too distracted to notice what was happening in my own marriage. The same voice that belonged to a man who was planning to rob me of hundreds of thousands of dollars and destroy my professional reputation for his own financial gain. I sat in my office chair and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of the betrayal. I put my head in my hands and let the tears come silently. My husband did not love me. He saw me as a target, a resource to be exploited and discarded. His parents were not my family. They were accomplices in fraud. Everything I had believed about my marriage was a lie, and I had been too trusting and too busy to see the truth. After 5 minutes, I wiped my eyes and sat up straight. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of my office. The woman looking back at me was successful, intelligent, and capable. She had built a thriving business from nothing. She had navigated complex financial situations and solved difficult problems for demanding clients. She was not going to fall apart because her husband turned out to be a criminal and her in-laws turned out to be grifters. She was going to fight back. Systematically, strategically, and with every resource at her disposal. I stood up, smoothed my clothes, and went downstairs to sit next to my husband on the couch. He put his arm around me, and I leaned against him like I always did. On the television, some crime drama was playing. The investigators were closing in on a suspect who thought he had gotten away with the perfect crime. I watched the screen and thought about Monday morning, when I would begin dismantling Michael's plan piece by piece. He thought I was too distracted to notice what he was doing. He thought I was too trusting to question him. He thought he had chosen the perfect victim. He had chosen a financial forensics expert who specialized in uncovering fraud and protecting assets. He just did not know it yet. Monday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Michael kissed me goodbye as he left for work, reminding me that he had a late meeting and would not be home until after 7. I responded with the same affectionate warmth I had shown for years, wishing him a good day and telling him I would probably work late as well. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I was on the phone. My first call was to Sarah-chan, the attorney who had handled the legal formation of my business and had become a trusted advisor over the years. Sarah specialized in complex financial litigation and had a reputation for being both brilliant and absolutely ruthless when protecting her clients. Her office was in Manhattan, and she typically charged $750 per hour. I had never needed her services for anything remotely personal before, but I knew without question that she was exactly who I needed now. Her assistant put me through immediately when I said it was urgent. Sarah's voice came through the line crisp and professional. I explained the situation in clear, factual terms without emotional embellishment. I told her about the dinner conversation I had overheard and understood because of my undisclosed fluency in German. I described the fraudulent credit cards, the unauthorized transfers, and Michael's stated plan to file for divorce while framing me as someone hiding assets. I mentioned his intention to threaten my business and professional reputation unless I agreed to a favorable settlement for him. Sarah was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then she spoke with the kind of focused intensity that made her so effective in her work. She told me that what I was describing constituted multiple serious crimes including identity theft, credit card fraud, wire fraud, and potentially embezzlement depending on how the money had been moved and documented. She said that my position was actually quite strong because I had discovered the scheme before Michael had executed his exit strategy, which meant we had time to protect my assets and gather comprehensive evidence. She instructed me to take several immediate actions. First, I needed to secure all my accounts by changing passwords and adding additional security measures. Second, I needed to open new accounts at a different bank entirely and begin moving my legitimate funds there in a way that appeared normal and routine rather than panicked. Third, I needed to engage a forensic accountant immediately to trace every dollar that had been taken and document the full scope of the fraud. Fourth, I needed to not confront Michael under any circumstances until we had gathered complete evidence and developed a comprehensive legal strategy. She emphasized this last point repeatedly. Any premature confrontation would give him the opportunity to destroy evidence, hide assets, or accelerate his timeline in ways that could make recovery more difficult. Sarah said she would clear her afternoon schedule to meet with me in person. She wanted to review all the documentation I had gathered and discuss the full range of legal options available. She also said she would begin preparing a consultation with a criminal attorney, because the level of fraud I was describing would likely warrant criminal prosecution, in addition to civil remedies. Before we ended the call, she told me something that I found oddly comforting given the circumstances. She said that in her 20 years of practice, she had seen many cases of financial betrayal within marriages, and the ones where the victim was financially sophisticated and discovered the fraud early almost always ended with full asset recovery and serious consequences for the perpetrator. She told me I had every advantage in this situation, and that Michael had made a catastrophic mistake in underestimating me. My next call was to James Morrison, a forensic accountant I had worked with on several client matters involving complex financial investigations. James had previously worked for the FBI investigating financial crimes before transitioning to private practice. He had an almost supernatural ability to trace money through layers of transactions and identify patterns that others missed. When I explained what I needed, he responded with professional calm and told me he could begin immediately. He said he would need access to all my accounts and statements, as well as any information I could provide about Michael's accounts and activities. He estimated that a preliminary analysis would take approximately 48 hours, after which he would have a clear picture of where the money had gone and how much had been taken in total. I spent the next several hours methodically changing passwords and security settings on every account I controlled. I enabled two-factor authentication everywhere it was available. I set up alerts for any transactions over $1,000. I downloaded years of statements from every account and credit card, organizing them into folders on my encrypted hard drive. The work was tedious and detailed, but I found it oddly soothing. These were concrete actions I could take to protect myself. Each password changed and each security measure implemented felt like reclaiming a small piece of control over a situation that had left me feeling powerless and betrayed. By noon I had opened new accounts at a completely different bank, one where Michael had never had any access or authorization. I transferred a significant portion of my liquid assets there, structuring the transfers to appear routine rather than suspicious. If Michael was monitoring my accounts, which seemed likely given his overall plan, I did not want him to see sudden unusual activity that might alert him that I had discovered his scheme. At 2 p.m, I drove into Manhattan for my meeting with Sarah. Her office was in a sleek high-rise in Midtown with expansive views of the city. The reception area had the quiet, understated elegance of a firm that catered to wealthy clients who valued discretion. Sarah met me in a private conference room, closing the door behind us and ensuring we would not be disturbed. I had brought printed copies of everything I had documented over the weekend: bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, credit card statements from the accounts I had never opened, screenshots of my account activity, the audio recording from Sunday dinner with timestamps, and a transcript I had created of the German conversation with English translation. Sarah reviewed everything methodically, making notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When she had reviewed all the materials, she looked up at me with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal outrage. She told me that the evidence I had gathered was extraordinarily compelling, and that Michael had been remarkably careless in several ways that would make prosecution straightforward. The credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge or consent constituted clear identity theft. The pattern of transfers from my accounts to his showed systematic theft. Most damaging of all, the recorded conversation provided direct evidence of intent and planning, which transformed what might have been argued as marital financial disagreements into unambiguous fraud. Sarah explained the legal strategy she recommended. We would continue gathering evidence for approximately 2 more weeks, allowing James to complete his forensic analysis and giving us time to secure all my assets and business interests. During this period, I would maintain completely normal behavior with Michael, giving him no indication that I knew anything. This would prevent him from destroying evidence or accelerating his timeline. Once we had complete documentation, we would execute what Sarah called a coordinated response. I would file for divorce while simultaneously filing criminal complaints for identity theft and fraud. We would seek immediate protective orders freezing Michael's assets and preventing him from accessing any accounts. We would provide all evidence to law enforcement and cooperate fully with any criminal investigation. Sarah believed that given the strength of the evidence and the amounts involved, prosecutors would be very interested in pursuing charges. She also addressed the aspect of Michael's plan that had perhaps disturbed me most deeply: his intention to threaten my business and professional reputation by claiming to have found questionable practices. Sarah said this was actually a point of significant vulnerability for him rather than strength. Any attempt to make false accusations against a licensed professional for the purpose of extortion would constitute additional crimes, including blackmail and filing false reports. Moreover, because I maintained meticulous records and operated my business with rigorous compliance standards, any investigation would quickly reveal that his accusations were baseless. She said that if he attempted to follow through on this threat, it would only add to the criminal charges he would face and demonstrate consciousness of guilt regarding the fraud. Sarah asked me how I was holding up emotionally. I appreciated the question because it acknowledged that I was dealing with something profoundly painful beyond just the financial and legal dimensions. I told her honestly that I was oscillating between cold analytical focus and overwhelming hurt. The man I had married and trusted completely had been systematically betraying me for at least 18 months, possibly longer. He had been stealing from me while I worked exhausting hours to build financial security for both of us. He had been planning to destroy my reputation and business while I cooked him dinner and supported his relationship with his parents. Every affectionate word and gesture over the past year and a half had been a performance designed to keep me unaware while he positioned himself to rob me. Sarah listened with the kind of attentive compassion that reminded me why I had always respected her. She told me that the betrayal I was experiencing was in some ways worse than if Michael had simply been having an affair or had fallen out of love with me. This was calculated exploitation of my trust and my earnings. It was a fundamental violation that revealed he had never viewed me as a true partner but rather as a resource to be used. She said that many people in my situation struggled with self-blame, wondering what they had missed or what they could have done differently. She wanted me to understand clearly that I had done nothing wrong. I had been a good partner who trusted my spouse and focused on building a life together. Michael had exploited those positive qualities deliberately. The fault was entirely his. Before I left her office, Sarah gave me specific instructions for the coming 2 weeks. I was to maintain my normal routine exactly. I should continue working, continue any social activities I usually engaged in, and continue treating Michael as I always had. If he asked about my work or finances, I should provide the same level of information I normally would, neither more nor less. I should not make any major purchases or financial decisions that would appear unusual. The goal was to be completely unremarkable so that Michael would have no reason to suspect that I knew anything about his plans. Sarah told me this performance would be difficult and emotionally exhausting, but it was essential for building the strongest possible case. I drove home in the late afternoon traffic feeling strange and disconnected. I had just spent several hours planning the systematic dismantling of my marriage and the likely criminal prosecution of my husband. In a few hours I would need to sit across from him at dinner and pretend that everything was normal. I would need to smile and ask about his day and discuss mundane household matters while knowing that he was actively working to destroy my financial security and professional reputation. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. Michael arrived home shortly after 7 as he had predicted. He looked tired, and he complained about his meeting having run long and being filled with corporate politics and posturing. I made sympathetic sounds while preparing a simple dinner of pasta and salad. We ate together in the kitchen, and the conversation flowed in familiar patterns that now felt hollow and performative. He told me about a colleague who was leaving his company. I told him about a client who was being unreasonably demanding about returns that were well within normal market parameters. On the surface, everything appeared exactly as it always had. 2 partners sharing the details of their days over a casual meal. But I kept thinking about Sunday dinner. I kept hearing his voice speaking in German about how exhausted he was from maintaining the charade of our marriage. I kept remembering how he and his parents had laughed about my being too distracted to notice what was happening. Every word he spoke now felt like another layer of deception. Every smile felt like a mask. I was sitting across from a stranger who wore my husband's face and spoke with my husband's voice but was fundamentally someone I did not know at all. That night as we got ready for bed, Michael was affectionate in ways that made my skin crawl. He kissed me goodnight and told me he loved me. I responded with the same words I had said countless times before. but they felt like ash in my mouth. I lay in the darkness next to him listening to his breathing even out as he fell asleep, and I thought about how thoroughly he had deceived me. How many nights had we lain like this while he was planning to rob me? How many times had he said he loved me while simultaneously working to destroy me? I eventually fell into an uneasy sleep, and when I woke Tuesday morning I did so with renewed determination. I would play this role flawlessly for as long as necessary. I would gather every piece of evidence. I would protect every asset. And when the time came, I would dismantle his entire plan with the same systematic precision I brought to my most complex professional challenges. Michael thought he had married someone too trusting and too busy to notice what he was doing. He was about to discover that he had actually married someone with the skills, resources, and determination to ensure he faced complete consequences for his actions. Over the following days I maintained my routine perfectly while working behind the scenes to build my case. James provided his preliminary forensic analysis, and it was even worse than I had initially understood. The total amount Michael had stolen or fraudulently borrowed in my name was not $200,000 as he had told his parents. It was actually $273,000. He had been more successful in his theft than he had admitted to them, perhaps wanting to keep some extra for himself or perhaps simply losing track in his eagerness to take as much as possible. James had traced the money to 3 separate accounts that Michael controlled. One was a personal savings account in his name only at a bank I had never heard him mention. Another was an investment account where he had been purchasing stocks and cryptocurrency. The third was most disturbing. It was a joint account with his parents, opened 8 months ago and funded entirely with money he had stolen from me. Friedrich and Ingrid were not simply aware of Michael's fraud. They were direct beneficiaries of it. They had been receiving regular transfers from Michael, money that had originally been mine, and using it to supplement their retirement income. This revelation transformed my understanding of the situation yet again. This was not just my husband betraying me with his parents' knowledge. This was a family conspiracy where all 3 of them were actively participating in the theft. The elder Hartmanns were not innocent bystanders or enablers. They were co-conspirators who had been receiving stolen funds for months. Every Sunday dinner where Ingrid had been coolly polite and Friedrich had been warmly friendly, they had been benefiting directly from money taken from me without my knowledge or consent. I showed James's report to Sarah, and her response was immediate and fierce. She said that the involvement of Michael's parents elevated this from a domestic financial dispute to an organized fraud scheme involving multiple parties. She said that prosecutors would be even more interested given the family conspiracy aspect and the substantial amounts involved. She also said that it meant we would be pursuing civil remedies against all 3 of them jointly, seeking recovery of the full amount stolen plus damages and legal fees. Sarah recommended that we move up our timeline slightly. She was concerned that with this much money involved and this many people participating, there was increased risk that someone might become nervous or careless in a way that would alert Michael that his scheme was at risk of exposure. She suggested that we plan to execute our coordinated response in 1 week, rather than 2. That would give us 10 days total from my initial discovery, which she felt was sufficient time to secure everything we needed, while minimizing the risk of premature discovery. I agreed with her assessment. The strain of maintaining normal appearances with Michael was taking a significant toll despite my best efforts. I was sleeping poorly and had developed a constant low-level anxiety that made it difficult to focus on my work. Several clients had commented that I seemed distracted or tired, which was uncharacteristic for me. I needed to bring this deception to an end before it began affecting my professional performance or my health. That Friday evening Michael mentioned that his parents wanted to have us over for dinner at their apartment on Sunday. He said they wanted to reciprocate for all the meals I had prepared, and that his mother was planning to make Sauerbraten, a traditional German pot roast that took days to prepare properly. He said it with such casual normalcy, as though we were simply a family maintaining loving relationships rather than co-conspirators in fraud planning their next interaction with their victim. I agreed pleasantly and asked if I should bring anything. Michael said his mother had everything under control but that I could bring wine if I wanted. I said I would pick up something nice. Internally I was calculating. This would be another opportunity to gather evidence. If they spoke in German again, which seemed likely given their pattern of using that language when they thought I could not understand, I might capture additional incriminating statements. I made a mental note to ensure my phone was fully charged, and the recording app was ready. The weekend passed in a strange fog of normalcy covering profound deception. Michael and I ran errands together on Saturday. We went to the farmer's market and picked up fresh produce. We stopped at a home goods store because he wanted to look at new towels for the guest bathroom. We had lunch at a cafe we both liked and talked about whether we should plan a vacation for the winter. From the outside, we looked like any successful couple enjoying their weekend together. No one watching us would have guessed that I was methodically planning to have him arrested, and that he was actively stealing from me while planning to divorce me and destroy my reputation. Sunday arrived. I dressed carefully in clothes that were attractive but not too formal. I wanted to appear exactly as I always did for these family dinners. I selected a bottle of German Riesling that I knew Friedrich particularly enjoyed. Michael and I drove to Queens in the late afternoon as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the city. We made small talk during the drive about his work and mine, about a movie we were considering seeing, about whether we should host Thanksgiving at our house or go to my parents' home in Connecticut. His parents' apartment building was modest but well maintained. We climbed the stairs to the third floor, and Ingrid opened the door before we could knock. She must have been watching for our arrival. She kissed Michael on both cheeks and then turned to me with her usual formal greeting. Friedrich appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron and looking jovial. The apartment smelled wonderful, rich with the scent of the marinating meat and spices. The space was small but tidy. The furniture was outdated but clean. There were photographs on the wall showing Michael at various ages and images of relatives in Germany that I had heard about but never met. We settled in the living room, and Ingrid served coffee and small cookies she had baked. The conversation began in English as always, covering safe topics like the weather and neighborhood news. Then Friedrich said something in German to Ingrid about needing to check the roast, and she responded that it should have another 20 minutes. They were not being secretive. It was simply natural for them to slip into their native language for practical domestic matters. But then Michael joined in, speaking German, and the nature of the conversation shifted. He told his parents that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. He said he had opened one final credit card in my name the previous week and had already charged $18,000 to it for purchases that he described as untraceable. He said he was now confident he would reach $300,000 before filing for divorce. His mother responded with clear pleasure, telling him how proud she was of his cleverness and planning. His father asked whether he had consulted with his attorney recently, and Michael confirmed that he had met with the lawyer just 2 days ago to review the divorce strategy. I sipped my coffee and maintained a pleasant expression while my phone in my pocket captured every word. They were so comfortable, so confident in their deception. It never occurred to them that I might understand what they were saying. They had categorized me as someone outside their circle, someone who could be discussed openly in German because I existed in a separate linguistic world. Their assumption of my ignorance was so complete that they did not even lower their voices or show any caution. Michael went on to describe how he planned to spend the weekend after he filed for divorce. He said he would go stay with a friend in Boston while the initial proceedings were filed, making himself unavailable for immediate confrontation or service of papers related to my likely response. He said his attorney had advised that creating some logistical complications early in the divorce would benefit his position by frustrating my ability to respond quickly. They were not just planning to rob me. They were planning to make it as difficult as possible for me to protect myself or seek remedy. Ingrid asked about the timeline again, and Michael told her he was planning to file the first week of January. He said that filing right after the holidays would be optimal, because I would be distracted with year-end business matters and family obligations. He also noted that he wanted to receive Christmas gifts from my family before revealing his intentions. His mother laughed and said that was very practical thinking. His father raised his coffee cup in what appeared to be a toast, saying in German that soon they would all be able to live more comfortably, and that I would learn not to be so arrogant about my success. We moved to the small dining table for dinner. The sauerbraten was excellent, served with potato dumplings and red cabbage. Ingrid was actually a skilled cook, and under different circumstances I might have genuinely enjoyed the meal and the effort she had put into preparing it. But every bite tasted bitter knowing that this woman and her husband had been receiving my stolen money for months, and were actively encouraging their son to steal more. They were eating food purchased with funds they knew were obtained through fraud while planning to take even more from me. The conversation continued to alternate between English and German. In English, they asked me polite questions about my work and made small talk about current events. In German, they discussed logistics of Michael's plan, reassured each other about the timeline, and celebrated how successful the scheme had been thus far. The contrast was staggering. They were performing the roles of caring family members while simultaneously conspiring against me with complete callousness. At one point, Ingrid asked me directly in English whether I was planning to expand my business in the coming year. It was a reasonable question given that she knew I ran a financial consulting practice. I provided a thoughtful answer about potentially bringing on an additional junior associate to handle growing client demand. What I did not tell her was that the business expansion I was actually planning would need to account for the time and energy I would be spending on divorcing her criminal son and pursuing legal action against their entire family for fraud. Her question was meant to appear interested and supportive. It was actually intelligence gathering to help them understand how much money I was likely to have available for them to steal. After dinner, we had dessert, a traditional German apple cake that Ingrid had also made from scratch. We ate it slowly while they told stories about Michael's childhood and their early years in America. They painted a picture of a close-knit family that had faced challenges together and supported each other through difficult times. The subtext of this narrative seemed designed to position them as deserving of financial support and to justify Michael's actions as a dutiful son helping his struggling parents. What they did not acknowledge was that stealing nearly $300,000 from me was not the same as a son voluntarily supporting his parents. One was generosity, the other was theft. We left their apartment as the evening was growing late. Michael drove us home while talking about how nice the dinner had been and how much his parents appreciated our visits. I made agreeing sounds while looking out the window at the city lights. The recording in my pocket was complete. I had captured nearly 2 hours of conversation, including detailed discussions of the fraud scheme, specific dollar amounts, timeline for the divorce filing, and strategies for complicating my ability to respond. Combined with James's forensic analysis and all the documentary evidence I had gathered, we now had an absolutely airtight case. When we got home, I went directly upstairs claiming exhaustion from a long week. Michael stayed downstairs to watch television. I locked myself in my office and immediately transferred the new recording to my encrypted storage and sent a copy to Sarah. Then I sat at my desk and allowed myself to fully feel the weight of what I now knew with complete certainty. My marriage was over. My husband was a calculating thief. My in-laws were co-conspirators who felt no guilt about their participation in defrauding me. And in just a few days I would be initiating actions that would destroy all of their plans and likely result in criminal prosecution for all three of them. I thought about the woman I had been 2 weeks ago. She had been happy in her marriage despite working too much. She had trusted her husband completely. She had welcomed his parents into her home and prepared elaborate meals for them. She had believed she was building a life with a partner who valued and respected her. That woman felt naive now, almost foolish in her blind trust. But she had also been kind and generous and open-hearted. She had not deserved what had been done to her. The woman I was becoming was harder, more guarded, more suspicious, but also stronger and more determined. I was learning that protecting yourself sometimes meant accepting that people you loved were not who you thought they were. It meant drawing lines and enforcing consequences even when it was painful. It meant choosing your own well-being over maintaining comfortable fictions about relationships that had never been real. Tomorrow I would call Sarah and tell her we were ready to move forward. The evidence gathering was complete. My assets were secured. I had documented everything thoroughly and professionally. It was time to stop performing normalcy and start demanding justice. Michael had chosen to betray me systematically over 18 months. I was about to show him what happened when you underestimated someone you assumed was too busy and too trusting to fight back. I straightened my shoulders and opened my laptop to begin reviewing the materials one final time before our meeting with Sarah. The scared, hurt woman who had listened to her husband plot against her in a language he thought she did not understand was still there inside me. But she was joined now by someone colder and more focused. Someone who understood that being kind did not mean accepting abuse. Someone who knew her worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. Someone who was ready to fight. Monday morning I arrived at Sarah's office before 9 with everything organized into a comprehensive briefing package. I had spent most of Sunday night after returning from the dinner with Michael's parents compiling the evidence into a clear, chronological presentation that documented the entire scope of the fraud. The package included the forensic accounting report from James showing $273,000 stolen or fraudulently obtained. It contained statements from every affected account with the unauthorized transactions highlighted and annotated. It held the fraudulent credit card documentation showing accounts I had never opened. Most importantly, it included transcripts of both recorded conversations with timestamps, the original German audio, and my English translations verified by a certified translator I had hired to ensure the accuracy would be unimpeachable in any legal proceeding. Sarah reviewed everything methodically over the course of 2 hours, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When she finished, she looked across her desk at me with an expression of grim satisfaction. She told me that in her entire career she had rarely seen a case of marital fraud documented this thoroughly or with evidence this strong. The recordings alone were devastating because they showed clear intent, detailed planning, and consciousness of wrongdoing. The financial documentation corroborated everything Michael had said in those conversations. The involvement of his parents and the joint account receiving stolen funds transformed this from a domestic dispute into a criminal conspiracy. She said that any prosecutor would be eager to take this case, and that Michael's attorney would almost certainly advise him to accept a plea agreement rather than go to trial where this evidence would destroy him. We spent the next several hours planning the execution of what Sarah called the coordinated response. The strategy was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, while giving Michael and his parents no opportunity to hide assets, destroy evidence, or take any protective action. Everything would happen within a single 48-hour period with precise timing to maximize impact and minimize their ability to respond. The sequence would begin on Wednesday morning. Sarah would file divorce papers on my behalf in New York State Supreme Court. The filing would include a petition for emergency relief seeking immediate freezing of all joint accounts and any accounts in Michael's name pending investigation of financial misconduct. Attached to the petition would be a comprehensive affidavit I would sign under oath detailing the fraud, supported by the forensic accounting report and extensive financial documentation. The affidavit would not include the recordings at this stage because Sarah wanted to reserve those for maximum impact later, if Michael attempted to contest the facts. Simultaneously with the divorce filing, Sarah would submit criminal complaints to both the local police department and the district attorney's office. The complaints would charge Michael with identity theft, credit card fraud, wire fraud, and theft. Separate but related complaints would charge Friedrich and Ingrid as accessories to fraud and recipients of stolen property, based on the joint account transfers. Sarah had already spoken informally with a contact in the district attorney's office who had indicated that given the amounts involved and the documented evidence, the cases would be assigned to investigators immediately. Also on Wednesday morning, I would meet with my bank and the credit card companies to formally report the fraud and begin the process of disputing the fraudulent charges and accounts. This would create an official paper trail with financial institutions showing that I had reported the crimes promptly upon discovering them. Sarah explained that this timing was important because it would preempt any argument Michael might try to make that I had known about the accounts or authorized the transactions. By Wednesday afternoon, Sarah expected that we would have initial responses from the court on the emergency relief petition. Assuming the judge granted the relief, which Sarah considered virtually certain given the evidence, all joint accounts would be frozen and Michael would be prohibited from accessing them or making any transfers. Sarah would also seek an order requiring Michael to provide a complete accounting of all his assets and accounts within 72 hours. Thursday would be when Michael would likely be contacted by police regarding the criminal complaints. Sarah anticipated that he would immediately hire a criminal defense attorney, and that attorney would probably reach out to begin discussing potential resolution. This was the point at which Michael would understand the full scope of what was happening, and that his entire plan had been discovered and countered. Throughout this process, I would maintain complete silence with Michael. Sarah was emphatic about this point. Once the divorce papers were filed, I was to have no direct communication with him whatsoever. Everything would go through attorneys. If he attempted to contact me, I was to document the attempt but not respond. If he showed up at our home, I was to call the police rather than engaging with him. Sarah said that Michael would likely go through a rapid progression of emotions including shock, anger, denial, and possibly attempts at manipulation or reconciliation. None of those reactions should elicit any response from me. The time for conversation had ended. We were now in purely legal territory. Sarah asked me how I wanted to handle the physical separation. Our home was in both names with me having provided the down payment and paying the majority of the mortgage. Sarah said I had every right to remain in the home, and that we could seek an order excluding Michael from the property. However, she also noted that staying in the house might be emotionally difficult, and that I should consider whether I wanted to be there during the initial phase of the divorce proceedings. I thought about this carefully. The house represented 4 years of my life and significant financial investment. I had chosen every detail from the paint colors to the landscaping. It was my sanctuary and my achievement. The idea of leaving it felt like allowing Michael to drive me out of my own home. On the other hand, Sarah was right that staying there would mean being surrounded by memories and managing the property, while dealing with the emotional turbulence of divorce and criminal proceedings. After considering both options, I told Sarah that I wanted to stay in the home. I would not let Michael's betrayal cost me the house I had worked so hard to create. If anyone was leaving, it would be him. Sarah nodded approvingly and said she would seek an order of exclusive occupancy as part of the emergency relief petition. This would legally require Michael to vacate the home and stay away from the property. She warned me that enforcing such an order sometimes required police involvement if the other party refused to comply, but she had found that most people eventually accepted the reality once they understood the legal consequences of violation. We discussed my safety, which was something I had not fully considered until Sarah raised it. She asked whether Michael had ever been violent or threatening. I told her honestly that he had never been physically aggressive with me in any way during our entire relationship. However, Sarah pointed out that people often behaved unpredictably when cornered and facing serious consequences. She recommended that I consider staying with family or friends for the first few days after the filings, or alternatively that I install additional security at the home and ensure that someone knew my whereabouts at all times. She also suggested that I inform my office manager and key colleagues that I was going through a difficult personal situation, so they could be alert to any unusual attempts to contact me or access my office. The practical nature of these discussions was oddly grounding. Sarah was treating this as a complex problem to be managed with careful planning and execution, which aligned with how I approach challenges in my professional life. It helped to frame the situation as something requiring strategic thinking rather than just emotional processing. I could be devastated about my marriage ending later. Right now I needed to be systematic and thorough in protecting myself and ensuring that Michael faced appropriate consequences for his calculated betrayal. Before leaving Sarah's office, we reviewed the timeline once more to ensure I understood exactly what would happen and when. Wednesday morning the legal actions would be filed. By Wednesday evening Michael would likely be served with divorce papers and would know that accounts were frozen. Thursday the criminal complaints would be active and he would probably be contacted by law enforcement. By Friday we would have a clearer picture of how he intended to respond and whether he was going to cooperate or fight. Sarah estimated that within 2 weeks we would know whether this was heading toward negotiated settlement or protracted litigation. I asked Sarah what she thought was most likely. She considered the question carefully before responding. She said that given the strength of the evidence, most reasonable attorneys would advise Michael to accept a settlement that included full restitution, an uncontested divorce with no claim to my assets or business, and cooperation with criminal prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. However, she noted that people rarely behaved completely rationally when facing the collapse of their plans and potential criminal consequences. Michael might convince himself that he could fight the charges or that I would back down if he applied enough pressure. His parents might encourage him to contest everything rather than accept responsibility. There was simply no way to predict with certainty how any individual would respond to this kind of situation. What Sarah could promise was that regardless of how Michael chose to respond, we had built a case that would prevail in both civil and criminal proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming. The documentation was meticulous. My actions from the moment of discovery had been appropriate and measured. I had not done anything that would undermine my credibility or legal position. If Michael wanted to fight, We were prepared to fight and confident of victory. If he wanted to settle reasonably, we would consider proposals that included full accountability and restitution. I left Sarah's office feeling something I had not felt since the previous Sunday when I first overheard Michael's conversation in German. I felt powerful. Not in an aggressive or vengeful way, but in the sense of knowing that I had the resources, the evidence, and the expertise to protect myself and demand justice. Michael had spent 18 months planning to destroy my financial security and professional reputation. He had believed I was too busy and too trusting to notice what he was doing. He had underestimated me catastrophically, and he was about to understand exactly how costly that miscalculation would be. I returned to my office and spent the afternoon working on client matters with renewed focus. The anxiety and distraction that had plagued me over the past week had lifted now that I knew we had a clear plan and would be executing it soon. I was able to concentrate fully on the portfolio analysis. I was preparing for a client meeting later in the week. The work felt like a return to normalcy. A reminder that I had built something valuable and meaningful that existed completely separate from my failing marriage. That evening when I returned home, Michael was already there preparing dinner. He seemed relaxed and cheerful, asking about my day and telling me about a project he was working on at his office. We ate together and watched television, and on the surface everything appeared exactly as it had for years. But I was counting down the hours until Wednesday morning when his entire world would implode. I was tracking every moment of this final performance of marital normalcy, knowing it was the last time I would ever pretend that our marriage was real, or that I trusted him. Tuesday passed in similar fashion. I went to my office and worked productively on various client matters. Michael went to his office and presumably continued with whatever combination of legitimate work and theft planning occupied his days. We came home in the evening and had dinner together. He told me that his parents had really enjoyed Sunday dinner, and that his mother wanted to know if we would be available for Thanksgiving. I told him I thought we might visit my parents in Connecticut for Thanksgiving this year, which was actually true though not in the way Michael would understand. I would indeed be with my parents for Thanksgiving, but I would be there as a woman navigating divorce and criminal proceedings against her husband, not as part of a happy couple making holiday plans. Tuesday night I packed a bag with clothes and essentials and put it in the trunk of my car. Sarah had convinced me that staying elsewhere for the first few nights after the filings was the prudent choice regardless of my desire to remain in my own home. I had called my parents and explained in broad terms that I had discovered financial fraud by Michael and would be filing for divorce. They had been shocked and immediately offered their support, insisting that I come stay with them for as long as I needed. My mother had cried on the phone, not just from sadness about my marriage ending, but from anger that someone had treated her daughter this way. My father had been quietly furious, asking detailed questions about the scope of the theft, and telling me that he would help me in any way possible including financially if I needed resources for legal fees. Their unconditional support reminded me that healthy family relationships existed. The contrast with Michael's parents, who were actively participating in defrauding me, was stark and painful. I thought about how different my marriage might have been if Michael had come from a family that valued integrity and taught their children to treat partners with respect and honesty. But that kind of speculation was pointless. Michael had made his choices. His parents had made theirs. Now I was making mine. Wednesday morning arrived. I woke before dawn and lay in the darkness listening to Michael's breathing beside me. This was the last time I would wake up next to him as his wife in any meaningful sense. By the end of this day, he would know that I had discovered everything. He would know that I had been gathering evidence while appearing oblivious. He would know that his plan had failed completely, and that he was facing serious legal consequences. I wondered how he would react. Anger seemed most likely, though I suspected there would also be disbelief and potentially attempts to blame me or minimize what he had done. I got up quietly and went through my normal morning routine. I dressed for work in one of my favorite suits, a charcoal gray that made me feel professional and confident. I applied makeup carefully, wanting to look composed and in control for what would be a difficult day. Michael was still sleeping when I left the house at 7, which was earlier than usual but not so unusual as to seem suspicious. I had told him the previous evening that I had an early client meeting, which was true in the sense that I was meeting with Sarah first thing. I arrived at Sarah's office at 7:30. She was already there with 2 associates who would be handling various aspects of the filings. We reviewed the final documents one last time. I signed the divorce petition, the emergency relief motion, and the sworn affidavit detailing the fraud. My signature felt heavy with significance. These were not just legal documents. They were the formal end of my marriage and the beginning of holding Michael accountable for his calculated betrayal. At exactly 8:30, one of Sarah's associates left for the courthouse to file the divorce papers and the emergency motions. Another associate left to deliver the criminal complaints to the district attorney's office and the police department. Sarah and I waited in her office, drinking coffee and discussing the likely timeline for responses. She estimated that Michael would be served with divorce papers by early afternoon. The court would probably rule on the emergency relief motion by late afternoon given the serious nature of the allegations and the strong supporting evidence. At 9 I began making calls to the credit card companies to report the fraudulent accounts. Each call followed a similar pattern. I identified myself, explained that I was the victim of identity theft, provided account numbers for cards I had never opened, and requested that the accounts be closed immediately and all charges reversed. The customer service representatives were uniformly sympathetic and professional, walking me through their fraud investigation processes and assuring me that I would not be held responsible for charges I had not authorized. Each call included documentation being sent to my email for my records. Each call represented another piece of Michael's plan being dismantled. By noon I had completed all the fraud reports with financial institutions. Sarah received confirmation that the divorce papers had been filed, and that a process server was en route to Michael's office to deliver them. The criminal complaints had been accepted by the district attorney's office, and an investigator had been assigned to the case. Everything was proceeding exactly as we had planned. I went to lunch alone at a quiet restaurant near Sarah's office, needing some time to process what was happening. I ordered food I barely tasted and sat watching people pass by on the street outside. They were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that my entire existence was being transformed in this single day. By tonight my husband would know that I had discovered his fraud. By tomorrow he would be dealing with both divorce proceedings and criminal investigation. Within a week his parents would also be facing criminal charges as co-conspirators. I thought about the Elena who had stood in her kitchen 2 weeks ago listening to music thumping through her beach house, confused and upset about a party she had not authorized. That story was not mine, but I understood the emotions it represented. The shock of discovering betrayal. The disorientation of learning that someone you trusted had violated that trust so thoroughly. The difficult choice between accepting the situation quietly or fighting back, even when fighting back would be costly and painful. I had made my choice. I was fighting back with every resource at my disposal. I was refusing to be a silent victim who absorbed the damage and moved on quietly. I was demanding accountability and consequences. And in making that choice, I was discovering strength I had not known I possessed. The woman sitting in this restaurant was not the same woman who had brought pot roast to her dining room table while her husband discussed stealing from her in a language he thought she did not understand. That woman had been trusting and generous but naive. This woman was harder, more careful, more aware of human capacity for calculated cruelty. But she was also more confident in her ability to protect herself and her refusal to accept treatment she did not deserve. My phone rang at 2:15. It was Sarah calling to inform me that Michael had been served with the divorce papers at his office. The process server had reported that Michael appeared shocked and had immediately asked to speak to me. The server had informed him that all communication should go through attorneys, and had provided Sarah's contact information. Sarah said we should expect to hear from Michael's attorney within the next few hours, and that Michael himself might attempt to contact me directly despite the instruction to use attorneys. She reminded me not to respond to any direct contact from him, and to document any attempts he made to reach me. At 3:30 Sarah called again. The court had granted the emergency relief motion. All joint accounts were frozen effective immediately. Michael was ordered to vacate the marital home within 48 hours, and to stay at least 500 feet away from both the home and my place of business. He was further ordered to provide a complete accounting of all his assets and financial accounts within 72 hours. The judge had clearly found the evidence of fraud compelling, and had acted decisively to protect my interests while the divorce proceedings moved forward. I felt a surge of vindication hearing this news. The legal system was working exactly as it should. A judge had reviewed the evidence and had recognized immediately that I was the victim of serious financial crimes and needed protection. Michael's plan to tie me up in complicated divorce proceedings, while he controlled stolen funds, had been completely thwarted. Instead, he was the one frozen out of accounts and being ordered to disclose everything. At 4:45, my phone began ringing with calls from an unknown number. I did not answer, following Sarah's instruction. The calls continued every few minutes. Then text messages started arriving. They were from Michael, and the progression told a clear story of his emotional state. The first message read simply, "Elena, please call me. We need to talk." I did not respond. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. "I can explain everything. You don't understand the full situation." I did not respond. 10 minutes after that, the tone shifted to anger. "You have no right to freeze my accounts. That's my money too. Call off your lawyer immediately." I did not respond. Another message followed shortly. "My parents did nothing wrong. How dare you involve them in this? You're destroying my entire family over a misunderstanding." I did not respond. Then came attempted manipulation. "After everything I've done for you and this marriage, after all the times I supported your career even when it meant I came second, this is how you repay me?" I did not respond. The messages continued for over an hour, cycling through various emotional appeals and attempted justifications. Each one I documented with screenshots and forwarded to Sarah without responding directly. Sarah replied that this was entirely expected behavior, and that I should continue to maintain complete silence. She said that Michael's messages actually helped our case by showing his awareness of the accounts being frozen and his reference to his parents' involvement, which corroborated the evidence we had gathered. By 6 that evening, the messages from Michael had stopped. Sarah called to tell me that she had been contacted by an attorney named Richard Brennan, who identified himself as Michael's divorce counsel. Brennan had asked for a meeting to discuss potential settlement. Sarah had agreed to meet with him on Friday afternoon, giving him time to review the case file and consult with his client. She told me that Brennan was a competent attorney who generally advised his clients realistically, rather than encouraging expensive litigation when the facts were not in their favor. She expected that by Friday Brennan would have explained to Michael exactly how bad his position was, and would be coming to the meeting prepared to discuss resolution terms. I drove to my parents' home in Connecticut that evening, watching the familiar roads pass by in the darkness. I felt exhausted but also strangely calm. The hardest part was over. The confrontation I had been dreading had occurred, not through any direct interaction but through the systematic legal actions we had planned and executed. Michael now knew that I had discovered everything. He knew that I had documented it thoroughly. He knew that he was facing serious consequences. And he was learning that the woman he had thought was too distracted to notice his betrayal was actually someone who would fight back with precision and determination. My parents were waiting when I arrived. My mother hugged me tightly and I finally allowed myself to cry. Not from grief over the marriage ending, because that relationship had died the moment I heard Michael speaking in German about how exhausting it was to maintain the charade. I cried from relief that the performance was over. I cried from the stress of the past 2 weeks maintaining normalcy while planning legal action. I cried from the pain of having trusted someone so completely only to discover they viewed me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. My father made tea and we sat in their kitchen while I told them the full story. I showed them the documentation I had gathered, played portions of the recordings with my translations, and walked them through the forensic analysis showing the full scope of the theft. They listened with increasing anger and disbelief. My mother kept saying she could not understand how someone could do this to another person, especially someone they claimed to love. My father was more focused on the mechanics, asking questions about how Michael had accessed accounts, and whether I would be able to recover the stolen funds. I explained that full recovery was likely but not certain. Some of the money Michael had already spent or transferred in ways that might be difficult to trace and reclaim. However, the combination of civil judgments and potential criminal restitution orders meant that he would be legally obligated to repay me even if it took years. His wages could be garnished. His assets could be seized. He would not be able to simply declare bankruptcy and walk away because fraud debt was not dischargeable. One way or another, he would face consequences for what he had done. My parents offered repeatedly to help financially if I needed resources for legal fees, or to cover expenses while accounts were being sorted out. I assured them I was fine financially. My business continued generating good income, and I had sufficient reserves to handle legal costs and household expenses. What I needed from them was emotional support and a safe place to stay while the initial crisis phase played out. They promised both without hesitation, reminding me that I was their daughter, and they would stand beside me through whatever came next. That night I lay in my childhood bedroom looking at the ceiling and thinking about how radically my life had changed in just 2 weeks. 14 days ago I had been a woman who believed she had a good marriage to a supportive partner. I had been focused on growing my business and thinking vaguely about when might be the right time to start a family. I had been trusting and open, believing that the people closest to me wished me well and valued me. Now I was a woman navigating divorce and criminal proceedings against a husband who had betrayed me systematically for at least 18 months. I was learning that my in-laws had been co-conspirators in fraud rather than the family I had welcomed into my life. I was discovering that I was stronger than I had known, capable of taking decisive action to protect myself even when it was painful and difficult. The Elena who had cooked Sunday dinners and brought pot roast to her in-laws felt distant now, like a person I had been in another lifetime. The Elena I was becoming was harder and more guarded. She would be slower to trust and quicker to verify. She would prioritize protecting herself rather than assuming others had good intentions. She had learned that people were capable of calculated betrayal, even while smiling and sharing meals and saying they loved you. But she had also learned that she did not have to accept betrayal quietly. She had learned that standing up for yourself was possible even when it meant standing alone. She had learned that demanding accountability was not vengeful or petty but necessary and just. And she had learned that the skills she brought to her professional life, the analytical thinking and strategic planning and meticulous documentation, could be applied just as effectively to protecting herself in her personal life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Friday would bring the meeting between the attorneys where we would learn how Michael intended to respond. Next week would likely bring contact from law enforcement as the criminal investigation proceeded. The weeks and months ahead would involve legal proceedings, financial recovery efforts, and the emotional work of processing betrayal and rebuilding trust in my own judgment. But tonight, lying in my parents' house safe and supported, I felt something unexpected. I felt proud of myself. Proud that I had discovered the fraud before Michael could fully execute his plan. Proud that I had gathered evidence methodically rather than confronting him prematurely. Proud that I had protected my assets in my business. Proud that I had demanded justice rather than accepting victimization quietly. Michael had chosen to betray me because he thought I was too busy and too trusting to notice. He had been spectacularly wrong. And now he would spend a very long time dealing with the consequences of that miscalculation. I closed my eyes and slept more soundly than I had in 2 weeks, knowing that I had done everything right and that whatever came next, I was strong enough to handle it. Thursday morning I woke in my childhood bedroom to autumn sunlight filtering through familiar curtains. For a brief moment between sleep and full consciousness, I forgot where I was and why. Then reality reasserted itself with crushing weight. I was 31 years old, sleeping in my parents' house because my husband had been systematically defrauding me for 18 months, and I had filed for divorce 2 days ago. The dissonance between the peaceful morning light and the chaos of my circumstances felt almost absurd. I checked my phone and found 17 missed calls from unknown numbers and 23 text messages. Most were from Michael, continuing his attempts at contact despite Sarah's explicit instruction that all communication should go through attorneys. The messages had evolved overnight from anger to what appeared to be panic. He wrote that the frozen accounts meant he could not pay his rent if he had to leave our house. He claimed he had bills due that he could not cover. He said I was being unreasonable and vindictive. He insisted that if we could just talk directly, we could resolve this misunderstanding without involving lawyers and courts. I forwarded all the messages to Sarah without responding, then blocked Michael's number entirely. Sarah had warned me that he would likely escalate his contact attempts before accepting that I would not engage directly, and she had been correct. Each message I ignored was another small act of boundary setting. Another refusal to be drawn back into a dynamic where he controlled the narrative and I accommodated his needs at the expense of my own protection. My mother made breakfast while my father read the newspaper at their kitchen table, a scene so normal and domestic that it felt surreal given what I was navigating. We ate together quietly, and I appreciated that they did not press me to talk about the situation or process my feelings out loud. They simply provided steady, calm presence while I gathered my thoughts for the day ahead. I had scheduled a 9 o'clock call with James Morrison, the forensic accountant, to discuss additional analysis he had been conducting. I took the call from my parents' guest room, closing the door for privacy. James's voice came through with his characteristic blend of professional detachment and genuine concern. He told me that he had spent the previous 2 days conducting deeper investigation into Michael's financial activities, and he had discovered several concerning patterns that extended beyond what we had initially identified. The first discovery was that Michael had been planning this fraud for significantly longer than 18 months. James had obtained access to some older account records through subpoenas that Sarah had arranged, and he had found evidence of preliminary activities dating back nearly 3 years. Small transfers that seemed innocuous at the time but fit the pattern of testing access and establishing procedures. Michael had been planning to rob me almost from the moment we purchased our house together. The marriage I thought we had been building was, for him, apparently an extended setup for financial exploitation. This revelation hit me with unexpected force. I had been processing the betrayal as something that developed over the past 18 months, perhaps triggered by resentment about our income disparity or influenced by his parents' financial struggles. Learning that it had been planned for 3 years meant that virtually our entire marriage had been fraudulent from his perspective. Every anniversary we celebrated, every vacation we took, every conversation about our future together had occurred while he was actively planning to steal from me and leave. The man I thought I had married had never really existed. He had been a performance from the beginning or very close to it. James continued with his findings. He had traced some of the stolen funds to purchases that were particularly disturbing in their implications. Michael had spent approximately $40,000 at luxury retailers buying expensive watches, designer clothing, and high-end electronics. None of these items were in our home, which meant he was storing them elsewhere or had already sold them. James suspected that Michael was converting my cash into easily portable valuable goods that he could liquidate quickly or take with him when he eventually left. This suggested a level of planning and intent that went beyond simply accumulating money. He was preparing for flight. More concerning were transfers totaling $65,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. James had been able to identify the account through banking records that showed the wire transfers, but accessing the account itself or determining what assets it held would be significantly more difficult. Offshore accounts were specifically designed to be opaque and protected from creditors and legal judgments. If Michael had been moving substantial funds offshore, recovering that money could be complicated and potentially impossible, depending on how he had structured the accounts and whether he had used additional shell companies or trusts to add layers of protection. I asked James what this meant for recovery of the stolen funds. He was honest in his assessment, which I appreciated even though the information was difficult to hear. Of the $273,000 we had initially identified, he now believed the actual total stolen was closer to $340,000 when accounting for the older transactions and the offshore transfers. Of that amount, he estimated that approximately $180,000 was likely recoverable through domestic legal proceedings. This included the funds in Michael's known accounts, which would be frozen and could be claimed through court orders, and the joint account with his parents, which could similarly be seized. The remaining $160,000 presented more significant challenges. The offshore account would require international legal cooperation, which was expensive, time-consuming, and not guaranteed to succeed. The luxury goods Michael had purchased might have already been sold or could be hidden. Money he had spent on living expenses or given to others was simply gone and could not be recovered directly. James explained that in fraud cases like this, victims typically recovered between 50% and 70% of stolen funds through civil proceedings and restitution orders. Full recovery was possible, but required the perpetrator to have attachable assets or income that could be garnished over time. I absorbed this information while looking out the window at my parents' backyard, watching birds move through the bare branches of late autumn trees. $340,000 stolen over 3 years of marriage. Offshore accounts suggesting sophisticated planning and preparation for disappearing with the funds. luxury goods purchases indicating he was converting my assets into forms he could easily transport or liquidate. This was not a spouse who made poor financial decisions or got in over his head. This was a criminal who had married me with the deliberate intention of defrauding me as thoroughly as possible before vanishing. James had more to share, and his tone shifted to something even more serious. In reviewing Michael's computer activity through forensic analysis of our home network, which Sarah had obtained permission to examine through the emergency court orders, he had discovered that Michael had been researching my business extensively. He had accessed my client files, copied confidential financial information about my clients, and downloaded proprietary systems and processes I used in my wealth management practice. The timestamps showed this activity had been ongoing for months, with the most intensive access occurring in the past 6 weeks. This discovery transformed my understanding of Michael's plan, yet again. He was not simply stealing from me personally. He was positioning himself to damage or destroy my business. The client information he had copied could be used to contact my clients directly and make claims about my professional conduct. The proprietary systems and processes could be used to start a competing business or sold to competitors. The confidential financial data about high-net-worth individuals could be leveraged for blackmail or sold to malicious actors. I felt physically ill hearing this. My business was not just my income source. It was something I had built from nothing through years of exhausting work and careful relationship building. My clients trusted me with their most sensitive financial information and their long-term security. The idea that Michael had violated that trust by accessing their confidential data, without their knowledge or consent, was both a personal betrayal and a profound professional ethics violation that could destroy my reputation and my livelihood. James explained that he had documented all of this activity thoroughly, including exact timestamps, files accessed, and data copied. This documentation would be crucial for multiple purposes. First, it provided evidence of additional crimes Michael had committed, specifically unauthorized access to computer systems and theft of trade secrets. Second, it gave us grounds to seek immediate injunctive relief preventing him from using or disseminating any of the information he had stolen. Third, it would be essential for notifying my clients that their confidential information had been compromised, which was likely a regulatory requirement under financial industry rules. I asked James what I needed to do immediately to protect my business and my clients. He outlined several urgent actions. I needed to change all passwords and access credentials for my business systems immediately. I needed to audit all client files to determine exactly what information Michael had accessed. I needed to implement additional security measures including two-factor authentication and potentially new encrypted systems for storing sensitive data. Most difficult, I needed to notify affected clients that their information had been compromised and explain the circumstances, which would inevitably damage some relationships, even though the breach was not my fault. After finishing the call with James, I sat motionless for several minutes trying to process the expanding scope of the violation. What had begun as the discovery that my husband was stealing money had grown into understanding that he was conducting a comprehensive attack on every aspect of my life. He was taking my money. He was accessing my clients' confidential information. He was copying my proprietary business systems. He was preparing offshore accounts and converting assets into portable forms. This was not opportunistic theft. This was methodical, planned destruction. I called Sarah immediately and briefed her on everything James had discovered. Her response was swift and decisive. She said we needed to file an emergency motion that afternoon seeking an injunction preventing Michael from using, disseminating, or benefiting from any information or data he had stolen from my business. We also needed to amend the criminal complaints to include charges related to unauthorized computer access and theft of trade secrets. She said that the offshore accounts complicated civil recovery, but actually strengthened the criminal case because they showed sophisticated planning and intent to hide assets, which would make prosecutors more aggressive in pursuing charges. Sarah also addressed the business implications directly. She said I needed to consult immediately with a professional liability attorney who specialized in data breaches and fiduciary responsibilities. Even though I was the victim of the breach, I likely had legal and regulatory obligations to notify clients and possibly regulators that confidential information had been compromised. Failure to make proper notifications could result in professional sanctions or liability, regardless of who actually stole the data. She had a colleague she could refer me to who could advise on exactly what notifications were required and how to handle them in a way that minimized damage to client relationships. The remainder of Thursday passed in a blur of phone calls and emergency meetings. I drove into Manhattan to meet with Sarah and her team to prepare the emergency injunction motion. We drafted detailed pleadings describing the business data theft and the immediate irreparable harm that would result if Michael was not prohibited from using or sharing the information. We attached James's forensic report documenting the unauthorized access and data copying. Sarah filed the motion with the court by 4 o'clock, seeking an emergency hearing for Friday morning. I then met with Amanda Reeves, the professional liability attorney Sarah had referred me to. Amanda had extensive experience advising financial professionals on regulatory compliance and breach notification requirements. After reviewing the scope of what Michael had accessed, she delivered difficult news. Under securities regulations and industry standards, I was required to notify every client whose confidential information had been accessed without authorization. The notifications needed to include a description of what information was compromised, what steps I was taking to secure their data, and what options they had for protecting themselves from potential misuse of their information. Amanda explained that some clients would inevitably be upset and concerned regardless of how carefully I handled the notifications. Some might choose to move their accounts to other advisors out of caution or loss of confidence. However, she emphasized that transparent and prompt notification was both legally required and the right thing to do ethically. Attempting to hide the breach or delay notification would be far more damaging in the long run both to client relationships and to my professional standing. We worked together to draft notification letters that struck the right balance between being appropriately serious about the breach while reassuring clients that I was taking comprehensive steps to protect their interests. The letters explained that my estranged spouse had gained unauthorized access to confidential client information as part of a broader pattern of financial fraud, for which he was facing criminal prosecution. They detailed the specific types of information that had been accessed. They outlined the security measures I was implementing to prevent any future unauthorized access. They provided resources for clients to monitor their own accounts and credit for any signs of misuse. And they offered to schedule individual calls with any client who wanted to discuss the situation in more detail. Amanda reviewed the letters carefully and approved them as meeting my notification obligations. She recommended that I send them immediately by both email and certified mail to ensure prompt delivery and documentation of compliance. She also suggested that I notify my professional liability insurance carrier about the situation, as the breach could potentially trigger claims if any client alleged that I had been negligent in protecting their information or that they suffered harm as a result of the unauthorized access. By the time I finished meeting with Amanda, it was after 7 in the evening. I was emotionally and physically exhausted from the intensity of the day and the constant expansion of the crisis I was managing. I drove back to my parents' house through evening traffic, my mind churning through everything I had learned. $340,000 stolen, 3 years of planning, offshore accounts, business data theft, client information compromised. Each new revelation was another layer of betrayal, another indication of how thoroughly Michael had deceived me and how comprehensive his plan to destroy me had been. My parents were waiting when I arrived home. I must have looked as devastated as I felt because my mother immediately pulled me into a hug and my father offered to pour me a substantial glass of wine. I accepted both the hug and the wine and sat with them in their living room while I explained what I had learned that day. They listened with expressions that progressed from concern to anger to something close to horror as the full scope became clear. My father, who had worked as an engineer for 40 years and approached problems with systematic logic, kept returning to the question of why. Why would someone marry another person with the explicit intention of defrauding them over years? What kind of mentality allowed someone to share a bed and a home and daily life with another person while simultaneously planning to rob them blind? How did someone maintain that level of deception without any apparent guilt or hesitation? I had no answers to these questions. I had been asking myself the same thing since the previous Sunday when I first overheard Michael's conversation in German. The Michael I thought I knew would have been incapable of this level of calculated betrayal. But that Michael had never existed. He had been a fiction created to facilitate the fraud. The real Michael, whoever that was, had viewed me from the beginning as a target rather than a partner. He had assessed my income potential, my trusting nature, my focus on work that left me less attentive to household finances, and he had determined that I was an ideal victim for systematic exploitation. My mother's perspective was different and perhaps more painful to hear. She said that people like Michael existed throughout society, looking for partners they could exploit rather than love. She said these predators often targeted successful, independent people because such individuals typically had resources worth stealing, and often had personality traits like trusting others and wanting to see the best in people that made them vulnerable to manipulation. She said that nothing I had done had caused this or made it my fault. Michael was simply a person without conscience who had identified me as someone he could use. We talked late into the evening about practical matters and emotional ones. My parents asked whether I felt safe, and whether I was worried that Michael might become dangerous as he faced escalating consequences. I told them honestly that I did not believe he would be physically violent, but I acknowledged that I did not really know him at all, so my judgment about his potential behavior was not reliable. We discussed whether I should consider a restraining order beyond the court-ordered stay-away provisions already in place. We talked about when I would be able to return to my own home, and whether I would feel comfortable there after everything that had happened. Eventually exhaustion overtook all of us, and I went upstairs to sleep. But sleep did not come easily despite my physical tiredness. I lay in the darkness thinking about the forensic accountant's report, and the offshore accounts and the stolen business data. I thought about my clients receiving notification letters explaining that their confidential information had been compromised by my criminal husband. I thought about the damage to my professional reputation and the relationships I might lose regardless of the fact that I was a victim rather than the perpetrator of the breach. I thought about the 3 years of marriage that had all been built on Michael's lies. The conversations we had about maybe starting a family someday. The vacations we took where I paid for most expenses without thinking about it because I earned more and that seemed normal in a partnership. The Sunday dinners I cooked for his parents while they sat in my dining room discussing how to steal more from me. Every memory was tainted now, transformed from something warm and real into evidence of how thoroughly I had been deceived. But somewhere in the dark hours of that sleepless night, something shifted in how I was processing the betrayal. The initial shock and hurt began to transform into something harder and more focused. Michael had planned this fraud for 3 years, but I had discovered it before he could execute his exit strategy. He had stolen $340,000, but I had frozen his accounts and was pursuing full recovery. He had accessed my business data, but I had documented the breach and was implementing comprehensive security measures to prevent him from using or benefiting from what he stole. At every turn, Michael had underestimated me. He had assumed I was too busy to notice irregularities in household finances. He had assumed I would not understand German and would not hear his conversations with his parents. He had assumed I would be too trusting to verify his claims or too conflict-averse to pursue serious consequences. He had assumed I lacked the skills or resources to fight back effectively. Every single assumption had been catastrophically wrong. I had discovered the fraud through a combination of circumstances and my own linguistic skills. I had documented it thoroughly using the same analytical abilities I brought to my professional work. I had engaged excellent legal counsel and forensic accounting expertise. I had taken swift, decisive action to protect my assets and initiate both civil and criminal proceedings. I had maintained perfect operational security during the evidence-gathering phase, giving Michael no warning that I knew what he was doing. I had executed a coordinated legal response that froze his accounts and secured court orders before he could take protective action. In short, Michael had chosen to defraud someone who possessed exactly the skills and resources necessary to defeat his scheme and ensure he faced maximum consequences. He had picked the wrong victim, and now he was learning that lesson in the most painful way possible. Friday morning arrived with cold rain that matched my mood perfectly. I had the emergency hearing on the injunction motion at 10 o'clock, and then Sarah's meeting with Michael's attorney at 2 o'clock. I dressed carefully in another of my favorite suits, a navy blue that conveyed both professionalism and authority. I wanted to look like someone who commanded respect and took themselves seriously, because that was exactly how I needed to present to the court. The hearing was in a courtroom in Lower Manhattan. Sarah met me outside and we reviewed our presentation one final time before going in. Michael was not present, But his attorney Richard Brennan was there looking distinctly uncomfortable. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Justice Patricia Morrison, who had a reputation for being extremely sharp and having no patience for nonsense. Sarah presented our motion efficiently, outlining the unauthorized access to business data, the theft of confidential client information, and the immediate irreparable harm that would result if Michael was not enjoined from using or disseminating what he had stolen. She walked the judge through James's forensic report showing the systematic data theft. She emphasized that this was not a marital dispute over jointly held information, but rather criminal theft of business assets and confidential third-party data that I had fiduciary obligations to protect. Brennan attempted to argue that the motion was premature, and that Michael should have an opportunity to respond to the allegations before being subjected to an injunction. Justice Morrison cut him off sharply. She said that the forensic evidence of unauthorized access was clear and undisputed. She said that the potential for harm to innocent third parties, specifically my clients whose information had been stolen, justified immediate protective action. She granted the injunction in full, ordering Michael to immediately return or destroy any and all data he had taken from my business systems and prohibiting him from using, copying, or disseminating any such information under penalty of contempt. The hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. As we left the courtroom, I felt a surge of vindication. The legal system was responding appropriately to what Michael had done. Judges were taking the allegations seriously and acting decisively to protect me and my clients. Every step of this process was confirming that my response had been correct, and that Michael's actions were being recognized as the serious crimes they were. Sarah and I had lunch before the 2 o'clock meeting with Brennan. She briefed me on what to expect. Brennan would likely present some version of a settlement offer that would include Michael agreeing to an uncontested divorce, and possibly to restitution in exchange for me agreeing not to pursue criminal charges. Sarah said we should listen to whatever he proposed, but that we should be very skeptical of any offer that did not include full accountability. She reminded me that I was not in control of whether criminal charges were pursued at this point. Those decisions belonged to prosecutors. However, my cooperation or lack thereof would influence how aggressively the cases were pursued. The meeting took place in a conference room at Sarah's office. Brennan arrived looking tired and frustrated. He began by saying that he had spent considerable time reviewing the evidence I had gathered, and had explained to his client exactly how serious his legal situation was. He said that Michael understood he had made terrible choices, and was now facing potentially catastrophic consequences. Brennan said his purpose today was to explore whether there was any path to resolution that could avoid protracted litigation and criminal prosecution. Sarah responded coolly that any discussion of resolution would need to start with Michael taking full responsibility for his actions, providing complete transparency about all stolen funds and hidden assets, and agreeing to meaningful consequences that included both substantial restitution and appropriate criminal accountability. She said that offers which sought to minimize what he had done or shield him from appropriate consequences would not be seriously considered. Brennan acknowledged the strength of the evidence but attempted to provide context that he apparently hoped would generate some sympathy. He explained that Michael's parents had been pressuring him for financial help for years, and that this pressure had intensified as their retirement savings proved inadequate for their needs. He suggested that Michael had started with small, unauthorized transfers intending to pay them back but had gotten in over his head as the amounts grew. He portrayed Michael as someone who made increasingly bad choices while trapped in a spiral of his own, making rather than as a calculating criminal who planned the fraud from the beginning. Sarah cut through this narrative efficiently. She noted that the forensic evidence showed planning dating back 3 years, offshore accounts, systematic data theft, and luxury purchases for Michael's personal benefit. This was not someone who made a few bad choices while trying to help his parents. This was comprehensive, premeditated fraud conducted by someone who had viewed his marriage as an opportunity for financial exploitation from the beginning. Brennan made his settlement proposal. Michael would agree to an uncontested divorce with no claim to any marital assets or my business. He would acknowledge full responsibility for the unauthorized transfers and credit card fraud. He would agree to a judgment requiring him to repay the full amount stolen, which Brennan acknowledged was approximately $340,000, over time through wage garnishment and asset seizure as necessary. In exchange, I would agree to provide minimal cooperation with criminal prosecution, essentially allowing the criminal cases to proceed without my active participation, but not actively supporting them either. Sarah asked what this proposal meant for Michael's parents given their direct involvement as recipients of stolen funds. Brennan said that Michael would take full responsibility and claimed that his parents had not known the money they received was stolen. Sarah laughed at this outright. She reminded Brennan that we had recordings of conversations where all three of them discussed the fraud explicitly. The claim that Friedrich and Ingrid were innocent recipients rather than knowing co-conspirators was flatly contradicted by evidence. Sarah presented our counterposition. Michael would agree to an uncontested divorce with no claim to any assets and immediate vacation of the marital home. He would execute a confession of judgment for the full amount stolen plus interest, costs, and attorney fees. He would cooperate fully with criminal prosecution, including providing testimony about his parents' involvement, if requested by prosecutors. He would agree to permanent injunctions preventing him from ever contacting me or coming near my home or business. His parents would similarly accept responsibility for receiving stolen property and agree to return any funds they still held plus face appropriate criminal consequences for their participation. In exchange for this comprehensive acceptance of responsibility and cooperation, Sarah said we would support a prosecution recommendation for reduced charges that acknowledged cooperation. However, she emphasized that Michael and his parents needed to face real criminal consequences, not simply civil judgments they might never pay, some amount of supervised probation at minimum, and possibly short jail sentences depending on what prosecutors ultimately recommended. Brennan said he needed to consult with his client about our counter-proposal. Sarah told him he had until Monday morning to respond, after which we would proceed on the assumption that Michael intended to fight rather than accept responsibility. She made clear that fighting would result in a far worse outcome for him, as all the evidence we had gathered would be presented in public proceedings and prosecutors would seek maximum sentences, rather than negotiated reductions. The meeting ended with Brennan looking even more tired and frustrated than when he arrived. After he left, Sarah turned to me and said that she believed we would ultimately reach a settlement along the lines of what we had proposed. She said that Brennan was too experienced not to recognize that Michael's position was hopeless, and that accepting responsibility and cooperating with prosecution was his only realistic option. The question was simply how long it would take Michael to accept that reality and agree to the necessary terms. I returned to my parents' house that evening feeling emotionally drained but also increasingly confident. Every interaction with the legal system had validated my response. Every meeting with attorneys had confirmed that the evidence I gathered was strong, and that Michael's actions were being taken seriously as the crimes they were. I was no longer operating from a position of shock and hurt. I was operating from a position of strength and determination. That weekend I worked on client notifications and business security improvements. I sent the required letters to every client whose information had been accessed. I implemented new security systems and protocols. I scheduled calls with my largest and most important clients to discuss the situation personally and reassure them that their interests were being protected. Several clients responded with concern, but also with support and understanding. They recognized that I was the victim of the breach and appreciated my transparency in notifying them promptly. I also spent time thinking about what came next beyond the immediate legal proceedings. I would need to rebuild trust with some clients. I would need to process the trauma of betrayal, and probably work with a therapist to avoid carrying this damage into future relationships. I would need to decide whether I wanted to stay in the house Michael and I had purchased together, or whether starting fresh in a new space would be healthier. I would need to figure out who I was as a divorced woman navigating the world alone rather than as part of a couple. But those challenges felt manageable now that I had moved through the initial crisis. I had discovered that I was stronger than I had known. I had learned that I could protect myself effectively even when facing sophisticated threats. I had proven that demanding accountability and refusing to accept victimization were not just possible but powerful. Whatever else came from this terrible experience, I was emerging from it with greater self-knowledge and confidence in my ability to handle whatever life threw at me. Michael had tried to destroy me financially and professionally. Instead, he had revealed to me just how capable I was of fighting back and protecting what mattered. That was perhaps the greatest miscalculation he had made in his long series of mistakes. He had underestimated me so thoroughly that he had actually made me stronger by forcing me to discover resources and determination I had not known I possessed. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that made everything seem sharply defined and unavoidable. I woke early in my parents' guest room and lay still for a moment, mentally preparing for what promised to be another difficult day. The weekend had provided a brief respite from the constant forward momentum of legal proceedings, but now we were returning to active combat. Sarah had given Michael's attorney until this morning to respond to our settlement proposal, and I knew that his answer would determine whether we were heading toward negotiated resolution or extended warfare. I checked my phone and found a message from Sarah that had arrived at 6:30. Michael's attorney had responded early requesting an extension until Wednesday to consult with his client and prepare a counterproposal. Sarah had agreed to the extension but had made clear that Wednesday was final, and that any further delay would be interpreted as unwillingness to negotiate in good faith. She had also filed formal amendments to the criminal complaints adding the computer access and trade secret theft charges, based on James's forensic findings. The district attorney's office had confirmed receipt, and had assigned a senior prosecutor named Robert Chun to handle the case given its complexity and the amounts involved. Before I could fully process this information, my phone rang with a call from my office manager, Patricia Hendricks. Patricia had worked with me for 4 years and managed the administrative operations of my financial consulting practice with remarkable efficiency and discretion. I had briefed her the previous week about the general situation with Michael and had warned her that there might be unusual contact attempts or complications, but I had not yet provided full details about the scope of what was happening. Patricia's voice was tense when I answered. She told me that Michael had shown up at our office building that morning at 7 o'clock and had attempted to gain access. The building security had stopped him because his name was not on the authorized visitor list for my suite. He had become increasingly agitated when they refused him entry, eventually claiming that he was my husband and had every right to access my business premises. Security had informed him that without being on the approved list, he would not be granted access regardless of his relationship to me. He had finally left, but not before making what security described as concerning statements about how I would regret excluding him, and about information he possessed that could damage my business. I felt a cold shock of alarm hearing this. Michael attempting to access my office was a direct violation of the court order, requiring him to stay 500 feet away from my place of business. More concerning were his statements about damaging my business, which suggested he might be preparing to follow through on his earlier plan to threaten my professional reputation and client relationships. I told Patricia to document everything security had reported, including exact quotes if possible, and to immediately notify building security that Michael was subject to a court order prohibiting him from coming near the premises. I also told her to alert all staff that Michael was not to be given any information about clients, schedules, or business operations if he somehow managed to contact them directly. After ending the call with Patricia, I immediately called Sarah and informed her about the office incident. Her response was swift and serious. She said that Michael's violation of the stay-away order was contempt of court, and that we needed to file an immediate motion seeking his arrest and sanctions. She also said that his statements about possessing damaging information and his attempt to access my office suggested he might be preparing to use the stolen business data in violation of the injunction the court had granted on Friday. She said we needed to seek an emergency hearing to address these violations before Michael escalated further. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.